We are very, very pleased at the Fall Christensen Lunch to have our new provost, Karen Kaivola, with us. Karen comes to us from Stetson University in Florida, where she taught in the English department, and she also served in a variety of administrative roles, the last being associate provost for faculty development. Karen has degrees from Georgetown University and also the University of Washington, and we've asked her today to talk about vocation, and of course, as the Christensen Center for Vocation sponsors this event, we're not only asking Karen to reflect on vocation, but it's also a way for all of you to reflect on your own sense of calling as well. That's kind of the other message of these lunches. So we hope that Karen's talk will indeed stimulate conversation among you about what it means to have a calling and to be in a college where a sense of vocation is taken seriously. Karen's title for her talk today is called The Accidental Administrator, Reflections on Vocation, and she's also indicated a desire for some questions at the end, so at the end of her talk we'll take questions from the audience as well. So now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Karen.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, everyone, for coming today. I know it's something of a cliche to say that it's an honor to give this kind of talk, but it is an honor for me to give this talk to you so early in my time at Augsburg in particular. And it is a special pleasure, I think, to look around the room and, after 2 months, recognize so many of you, and to even know many of your names. So I feel really good about that. One of the sort of odd things for me about being at Augsburg is the number of people, including Mark, who actually pronounce my last name the way it should be pronounced after a lifetime of not pronouncing it in the Finnish way, but in an Americanized version that sounds more like, initially sounded like Kaivola, then went to Kaivola. Now to hear Kaivola in the way that I know it should have been said all along is a little disconcerting and humbling. So, but I thank you for that education here that I've received not only from Mark, but from many of you as well. Okay, so you might be wondering why there would be a photo of the skyline in Seattle behind my title and in a talk about vocation. And really that's because the story that I'm going to tell today is a personal story, and this is the landscape that I grew up in and lived in for my first 33 years, and that does inform my story at key points. So in addition to going with the blue that I decided to go with, I thought that it would be nice to sort of have this as a reminder of sort of where I come from and what grounds me in many ways still. So I think, first of all, that perhaps a better subtitle for my talk might have been A Journey Towards Vocation, given that the whole concept of vocation is relatively new to me, and it is indeed a little bit intimidating to address a group of people who have been living with the concept of vocation for much longer than I have. So it is a journey towards vocation. It is a personal story rather than a philosophical consideration, and it will be rooted in my own experience. But what I'm going to try to do as well is put the sort of framework of vocation into dialogue with some other frameworks that operate, I think, in our culture around the idea of work and which have informed me at various points in my life as well. So let's see if I can get this to work. Among many of the ideas about work that circulate in our culture is what I would call the passion hypothesis. That is to say, you hear things like follow your bliss, or passion, follow your passion and success will follow you, as if we even can discern early on in our lives what that bliss or what that passion might be. But I still hear it from people, and I heard it from some of my friends in Florida as I was wrestling with this decision, in questions like, who ever will find bliss in serving as a provost anywhere. And I have to admit, I didn't really have a good question to that, or good answer to that question when it was framed that way, because I had observed several provosts over the course of my career and had met others, and bliss was not the first word that would come to mind. But I did have some early passions. I was always an avid reader, so I loved books. I grew up in Seattle and had the chance to work out in the national parks, and so I loved the mountains and I loved nature. I loved that poster, which used to hang in my office and before it got too faded. I loved dance. Obviously, that didn't stick. I didn't pursue that kind of career. And I loved Seattle, so I thought, in fact, that I would never leave. I also loved the coastline of Washington State, the ruggedness and the sort of mystery and atmospheric moodiness of it. So I didn't find anything really in my early life, although I did contemplate for a while becoming a forest ranger or trying to figure out how I could have a career reading books. So I went to Georgetown, where I majored in English, and where I also discovered a passion for art from the Italian Renaissance and also from the modern period. And I guess I would ask you to hold the thought about the modern period because it does sort of come back again as a theme. But I wasn't to find any kind of career direction through any of these passions, at least not directly. So what did I do after graduation? Well, I bicycled the Baja Peninsula, which is about 1,000 miles or so, camping out with one other person, and we carried our own water with us. I did things like climb Mount Rainier. That is not a picture of my party or group, but it could have been. It looked just like that. And I worked on a farm in Norway, of all places, which now, of course, circles back in a meaningful way now that I find myself here at Augsburg. But sooner or later, of course, I had to settle down and find work. And so I thought I would share with you this quote from Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad that I like. So no, I don't like work. I'd rather laze about and think of all the fine things that can be done. I don't like work. No man does. Conrad was a man of his time, so yeah, man does. But I like what is in the work, the chance to find yourself, your own reality for yourself, not for others. So I would call this the sort of second hypothesis after the follow your bliss kind of hypothesis about how you find meaningful work. So this is the idea, of course, that it's through the work itself that you find yourself. So I did indeed, eventually, as you might guess, go to work. And I'm not actually putting my very first jobs up here because they were too unpleasant, really, to share. But my first jobs after my various adventures on bikes and in mountains was, in fact, at the School of Public Health at the University of Washington. And within a 3-year period, I held a number of different jobs, or at least was sort of my title was reclassified in my same job, as I moved more towards the administration of grants and contracts. So what this clarified for me above all else is that I was desperate to go back to school, that I didn't like this work at all, but I would not say that I felt any kind of vocational calling at this point towards teaching or becoming a professor or anything like that. In fact, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that I made my way through graduate school telling myself stories like this. Okay, well, I will get a master's degree, but then I'm going to stop. Okay, well, I'll keep taking courses and serving as a TA, but I'm not going to take exams or write a dissertation. Okay, well, I have the PhD, but I'm not going to leave Seattle because this is a place that I love so deeply. And you know how the story goes, so you know already that I ended up here in Florida, not exactly the hub of intellect or culture, although I think if you look closely, you might imagine that those glass buildings down by Fort Lauderdale are actually a stack of books. But I don't think they are. I think they're either gold bars or they're office buildings. So I lived pretty much where that, I don't know if this is a pointer or not, but I lived sort of where that Golfer's Head is, a little bit north of Orlando. That's where I ended up. But on the more serious side, it was a real university. There's a picture of it. And I did, as Mark says, hold a series of positions while I was there. And I've tried to, I'm sorry the green doesn't show up as well as I had hoped it would, because what I was trying to highlight here is the way that for most of the 22 years I was at Stetson, I was juggling roles between being a faculty member, and I want you to hold the thought that I had left Seattle in order to have a faculty job, and doing administrative work. So after the, after the director of the UW English Advising Office, a period I held for 2 years after finishing my degree in order to stay in Seattle, but which also allowed me to publish my dissertation as a book, so that was a good thing. From the director of the Women and Gender Studies program to the university gender equity advisor to the associate dean to the associate provost, none of those were jobs that I had sought. They were jobs that were offered to me and which I found impossible to turn down because I felt that taking them would do good in the context of Stetson University. As some of you know, at the time when I was invited to serve as a gender equity advisor and as associate dean, there were no women above the level of department chair at Stetson. There were no deans, there were no associate deans, there was certainly no provost or president. Even on the administrative side, I think we had a female CFO for a couple of years who was not well liked and who ended up leaving fairly soon. And the culture was not friendly to women at the time. But the president invited me to undertake this work with him, and it was impossible to say no. And it was actually, you know, when I look back, and really it felt in retrospect like 7 years of sort of beating my head against the wall. When I look back now, I see that it really did make a difference. You know, we have a female president at Stetson now, we have a female provost, we have a number of female deans. That's not the only way that you can measure progress, obviously, in gender equity work or diversity work, but it is one indicator of the progress that was made. But I was pretty conflicted through many of these years. I found it really difficult to navigate both of these identities, because I tended to feel when I was in a faculty context that people saw me as an administrator, or that I had a kind of administrative perspective that a lot of my colleagues didn't have. And when I was with the administrative people, I felt like a faculty member 100%. So it was this long period of soul searching, like, who am I? Why am I doing both of these things? Does it make any sense at all? Why am I bringing this on myself? And then I decided to leave administrative work in 2008. I felt like I had run the course as an associate dean. It was time to go back to the faculty, and I really looked forward to it because I had what had been an early interest. Actually, my first acquaintance was not a passion, and it was not even an interest, but a growing interest and passion for Virginia Woolf. The more I got to know her, the more I got to know her works. So I was eager to go back to the life of the mind, to teaching, and to thinking about ideas in British modernism. So I started transitioning out of my role as Associate Dean in 2008, only to be invited in 2009 by the new provost to serve as the first Associate Provost of Faculty Development, another role I couldn't turn down because the need for it was so great. So that leaves me with what I would call hypothesis number 3, the practice hypothesis that passion follows you as you put in the work. Rather than you following your passion, then your passion sort of grows out of the work that you do. And I think in my experience, one of the things that I would suggest is that there's some truth to this. This bears out in my experience, both about Woolf, about my faculty work. I was the kind of teacher who broke into a cold sweat for the first 15 years of teaching. It took me a long time to get over it. It's like just as I got over that, then I sort of give it up. So, instead of stay there in that comfortable place, I went on. But it also happened in my administrative work because I saw that I could really make a difference there. So now I'm going to get close to the part of the story that involves Augsburg. So one of the things that I had started thinking about more as an associate dean was, of course, liberal education and why it mattered to me to the degree that it did. And I love this quote from William Cronin's essay, Only Connect, a wonderful reference to E.M. Forster's Howard's End that actually ends with that kind of idea. But I love the idea of liberal education as liberation from inherited ideas and prejudice, but I also love it as an idea of liberation that is ultimately also a constraint because of what we owe others in the world. And so that's an idea that has really resonated with me for quite a long time, and that interestingly, I think it's my administrative trajectory that has underscored that for me even more powerfully than my faculty work, although certainly it's been informed by my faculty work as well. So here's a slide you'll all recognize. The next part of my journey was that I had, and some of you have heard me say this, so your part in this now will be to see if I tell the same story every time. But in January of last year, so not even 12 months ago now, but getting close to it, I had what I've called in various contexts an epiphany. And it was in the context of a retreat that the provost at Stetson had organized for her deans and me and other people who reported directly to her. And all of them were new, by the way, because the new administration had come in and pretty much cleaned house. So I was one of the last people standing from the old administration. But I looked around the room in the context of this retreat, and I realized that I did have a kind of depth of experience and perspective that some of my newer colleagues didn't have. And so it occurred to me that I might have a role to play, certainly in that group. Like I could make something happen with them that would be really hard for anybody else to do. But the corollary part of that realization was that I might be able to be of service outside the context of Stetson. And so that occurred to me, I remember it really clearly, in the middle of this retreat. And about a week and a half later, I got a phone call from Oscar Page, who is a consultant, the search firm consultant at Augsburg, about this position. So from that point forward, in almost I want to say a creepy kind of way, because it really kind of messes with my head, the way things happened, everything started to fall into place in a way that I'm still kind of wrestling to make sense of or have a coherent narrative to tell about. But I just want to note a few moments in that trajectory. So I changed my registration at the AAC&U conference from a pre-conference workshop on faculty development to one that was titled, provocatively, So You Think You Want to Be a CAO? And at that meeting, which essentially confirmed my sense that I was maybe ready for this kind of move, but also gave me some cautionary notes, I met somebody named Bill Kraft, who some of you may know. He's the president now at Concordia at Moorhead, and he's the former provost at Luther College. And he knew the dean at Stetson that I had worked with, and he also knew our new colleague in the music school that we had just hired, who had also come from Luther College. So all of a sudden, Lutherans are in my kind of constellation in a way that they've never been before. I had expressed some reservations to Oscar about whether this would be a good fit for me, and he urged me to look closer at some of the materials on the web, which really connected for me with a lot of what I hold most dear around liberal education. So it seemed like the way that Augsburg talked about who it is and what it aspires to was both deeply informed by the Lutheran tradition and by this powerful commitment to liberal education in the context of professional study. All that really resonated powerfully with me. And I started learning more about Augsburg and thinking, yes, maybe this would be an interesting place for me. When I went to the airport interview, and I don't know if I've actually told many of you this part of the story. I ended up sharing a meal with Oscar the night before and learned in that meeting that he actually knew the former president at Stetson, the one that I had worked with on the gender equity work, and that Doug Lee, my former president, who actually died suddenly of a health-related problem very soon after stepping down, had actually approached him at some point in the past about serving at Stetson. And so all of a sudden, and Doug Lee was this really powerful mentor for me who had really provided so much wisdom and insight, and it felt like he was sort of channeled in that room and space, and that I had his blessing in some way for like moving forward, and it was just really powerful. And then, of course, there was the progress being made in Minnesota on marriage equality, which I didn't even realize when I applied for this job, but was absolutely moved beyond my ability to say that we were actually here. This was after, of course, I was offered the job. We were looking for a place to live. When the governor signed the bill into law, we were here when we learned that DOMA had fallen. We were in the Target parking lot, so it was pretty amazing. We put our house up for sale. It sold within 3 hours. We were able to find a place to buy here on a 4-day visit in the middle of May, I think. So just that, and then we were able to arrange the closings on both within 3 days of each other, and nothing held up either one of them. So it seemed like, this is my language, the universe was smiling on us here. So, and then I would finally say that a lot of the challenges and issues that I've heard articulated here at Augsburg are so familiar to me that it felt like the kinds of work and the projects that I've been put in charge of over the last, 8 or 9 years had been like in preparation for, oh yes, we did that too. So it's been a process for me here of sort of learning more about Lutherans, and of course I'm probably of all the speakers you've had talking to you about vocation, the one who has used that word the least. But it has resonated with me in a really powerful way over the last, maybe 4 or 5 months, because I think I read this as I was trying to learn more about Augsburg and Lutherans. This is a translation of Buchner's, I think it's a very famous quote, but what I love here is the idea of deep gladness. The deep gladness meeting the world's needs kind of resonates with some of the other quotes about work that I've shared with you earlier, but deep gladness seems like such a complex idea to me. It is not, as I sort of referenced my friend who questioned why one would seek a provost's role about following one's bliss. But I really believe it is a place that one might find deep gladness that isn't always going to look like happiness, but is going to be much more rich and sustaining and powerful. So I feel like I've come a far distance from the idea of following one's bliss as I have proceeded throughout my career. And if there's a key message here in everything that I've said, I think it is the kind of tension that I feel between the idea of somehow mysteriously or magically knowing, and I always was somebody who wishes I could mysteriously or magically know, and known earlier with less strife somehow than I have, but that I think that sometimes this idea of vocation or calling grows out of or follows from experience in ways that you could never foresee kind of when you're in the midst of it. So I will leave you with that and happily take whatever questions you have, and hopefully have not overrun my time. So. Thank you.
Karen has graciously requested that there be questions, and is happy to start a little conversation here. We have a few minutes left, so we have to use the mic though, because this is on tape and it won't be picked up unless we use the mic. So questions for Karen?
Thanks, Karen. I met you yesterday, actually, for the first time. I'm Andrea in the Study Abroad office. This is just not even a question, but more of a observation about what you were saying. I think when you were talking about some of the different roles that you took at Stetson, and as they sort of came to you, you kept saying it was sort of impossible to not do them.
Right.
And I think that's sometimes how I feel what vocation sometimes is sort of, this thing appears and it's sort of like, I really don't have a choice but to do this thing. So just an observation, since you didn't necessarily connect that, but maybe that was a subtext to what you were saying.
Right.
So.
No, I think that, thank you for that comment, because I think that that's really true. I think that when I think about my early, almost kind of fledgling experiences of something that feel like they align with the idea of vocation, it is those kinds of moments where one feels kind of compelled to do something. It is actually something I ended up feeling about my first faculty job too. Like, I had to do this. I couldn't stay in Seattle, even though it was going to be so difficult to leave, because I had to pursue that experience. But I think that was still kind of focused on me in a way that as these other roles came along, it was less focused on me. So I think that there's some difference in my trajectory around that question too.
Thank you so much. It was beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
I'm curious to hear if you could talk more a little bit about the struggle and strife and of the angst of trying to figure out a path. And particularly, I haven't heard you talk about your work in women's studies and feminism. And so if you can make some connection between maybe what you experienced and your broader understanding of women. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if I can comment on my broader understanding of women, or if I want to do that here, but but I will say that I came from Seattle, which was like Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's a fairly progressive part of the country, and I found myself I chose to go to a place that was much more conservative and very different culturally, and part of that was around gender roles. Part of it was around race and ethnicity too. And this work was actually intertwined, and part of it was around sexual identity and orientation, so it was all entwined with that as well, although I was specifically the gender equity person. I think that what made it possible, I think, for me to be effective in the work that I did at Stetson around gender equity was that people, men and women, shared this commitment and didn't quite know how to make it happen. So when I went on to the president's cabinet, and they were all men, they were all sort of well-meaning men. They wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to have more diversity throughout the institution. They wanted to strengthen the gender studies program. I mean, not uniformly. There was some passive resistance, I'm sure. And it was kind of like for 3 or 4 years, imagine a seminar, an advanced seminar, for 3 or 4 years. You don't meet as frequently as you do a regular class, but you meet at intervals, and your work is to try to move that group forward so that they own this and have some sense of how to proceed in their various areas. And their various areas might have been facilities or finance or the academic program, but where they come out of it with some sense of something concrete to do. And so I think that I am someone who was able, for whatever set of personal reasons, to function effectively with them, meeting them where they are, so to speak, and helping them get somewhere else, as opposed to, I think, the previous generation of feminist scholars and teachers at Stetson had felt, I believe, that they had to be much more sort of radical somehow and stand outside that. They weren't necessarily interested in doing that kind of work. So there were other women, out there pushing the envelope and doing that kind of work. And in fact, the reason I stepped down in 2004 was because I thought that gender equity work at the institution could probably be moved along further now by somebody other than me. That my sort of moment there, I'd done as much as I could. So, I mean, I did direct the gender studies program for a number of years, and certainly tried to extend it more throughout the curriculum and involve people from across campus and bring diversity much more into sort of feminist thinking at the institution as well. And that was also very rewarding. Yeah, thank you.
Karen, there's been a recent article in the Times about how literature, they had to do a sociological study for this, how literature actually creates or fosters empathy. It was disturbing to me that they had to do the sociological study, but, and I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how literature informs the work that you do. I think you've given us some hints about that, but I'm curious about that.
Oh, wow, what a question. I think what comes to mind when you ask that question, on the one hand, is something similar to what I implied about Seattle throughout the talk, that it's sort of grounding for me. Certainly literature is also that, and offers for me sort of insight, wisdom, and all the rest of it. I am actually somebody, I think that storytelling does foster empathy. I'm always cautious about thinking maybe literature is somehow exempt from the other arts, and sorry to people who are in the other arts here, maybe especially music. You know, one of the things I carry around with me that has stuck with me is something I read years ago about how Nazis in World War II were very cultured people, many of them, and it didn't seem to help them with empathy. So that's a kind of live and active sort of question for me. But certainly literature, reading, the kind of activity it is, the solitary part of it, the imaginative part of it, the sharing part of it, all has made me certainly acutely sensitive to language and the language that I use, and in ways that perhaps facilitate communication with various groups too, and help to establish a kind of empathetic connection. I think that, to sort of speak to your question more directly, for some complicated set of psychological reasons, and we need our psychology professors to help us with this, I have also been someone from the earliest moments in my life who has had trouble taking sides, and has, even as a child, kind of stood outside little gangs of children and said, no, I won't play under those rules. So I don't know where I get that. I can really trace it to no one in my family who has shown that particular form of courage. But I think that together, maybe with a more sort of literary sensibility, accounts for some of what I've done too.
Hello, Karen. I'm thinking of your title, Accidental Administrator, and I think that narrative plays very well in this room where I see a lot of faculty. And I wonder if you ever could have come and written Intentional Administrator, like if that's even a possibility. And how much do we sometimes back up and redefine our narrative as this was just an accident, because that looks better. I mean, some of my faculty friends, heaven forbid, well, is Karen one of those, when I was on the committee, you know, does she really want to teach or does she want to be administrator? And it's better if I was able to say, she really wants to teach, but she's been drawn into administration. and so I just want to I think there's, as an administrator, that there should be some intentionality about that. And I just challenge you to think about that.
Thank you for that question. Well, thank you for that provocative comment, which will give me food for thought moving forward. I had actually shared that expression with your former day student body president when I was here on my campus visit, Patrick Duchesne. And he wrote me the sweetest email afterwards. He said, you know, I've been thinking about how you characterized yourself as an accidental administrator, and I don't think that's right, he said. I think you found your vocation, he said. So. But you're right, in a sense, I think. Maybe accidental administrator suggests a lack of ownership that it's time I actually claim more fully. So thank you.